Good afternoon. Happy Lord's Day. Happy Sunday. I'm going to do my best to share some very, very important parts of this book, Redeemed by Fire, The Rise of Popular Christianity in Modern China by Lian Xi, as well as comparing it a little bit with accounts in My Unforgettable Memories by Lian Xi. At least at the time of the writing of this book, Lian Xi is a professor of history at Hanover College and the author of at least another book related to the history of Christianity in China. And Lian Xi wrote this book in her late 70s, probably, if not 80s, and is a pediatric neurosurgeon. So I believe the credibility of these works, especially with all of their firsthand accounts. Both of them have an amazing number of citations. Actually, Dr. Xu has all the citations after each chapter, major references for every chapter, every claim. And Lian Xi has probably about a sixth of the book are notes and references for every claim. Lian Xi also had personal interviews with someone who served for 20 years as Watchman Nee's stenographer and secretary from 1932 to 1952-ish. And that person also direct interviews with many others who were valuable sources of oral history on the subjects, along with their personal collections of historical documents. This book is published by Yale University, and this book was also published with Dana Roberts, who he went to China to make sure that these accounts were factual by multiple witnesses because he knew the litigious nature of the group that follows Watchman Nee, mainly the Lord's Recovery. So he wanted to make sure that his name is on something that is very credible and based on the accounts of multiple witnesses. So I'm going to try to give a recap of important points in this book. According to this book, who was Watchman Nee? It's a very, very brief version. He's the son of a junior officer in the Imperial Maritime Customs, and also the son of a mother who was inspired in her youth by Zhu Jinhong, the first Fuchao woman and the second in the country to have gone to study in America, and who became a medical doctor. So Watchman Nee's mom, Lin Haiping, was attending a school to undertake similar medical studies in the United States, but then it says her ambitions were crushed when her parents called her back to Fuchao for an arranged marriage in 1899. So Watchman Nee was born in 1903, and his mother turned mostly to the mahjong table. 1920, she went to a revival meeting of a female preacher, Yu Si-du, Shanghai-based revivalist, perhaps the best-known female preacher of the day. They had met, Nee's mother and this revival preacher had met in 1897. Her zeal for the gospel had continued, whereas Watchman Nee's mother's zeal had waned, had become, it says, only ashes of youthful dreams. But when they went to this revival meeting, Watchman Nee and his mom, Watchman Nee being now 17 years old, they had a genuine born-again experience. Then through Yu, Nee met an English missionary named Margaret E. Barber, who turned out to be the single most important influence in Nee's theological development and probably also his person. Many of us know a little bit about M.E. Barber. She was a very independent and dominating character, and she had severed her ties with the official missions, Christian missions, and returned to China as a freelance evangelist. And then Watchman Nee, by his own account, said that he was an unusually sensitive and emotional adolescent, and he was often given to violent swings of mood between the extremes of great sorrow and great joy. After he and his mom were baptized by M.E. Barber, it says that he was almost instantly plunged into a feverish search for a higher spiritual life than what he had previously found, either in his mother or in denominational churches. So that's kind of the start of Watchman Nee's life as a Christian minister. Early years of ministry, Watchman Nee sought out the companionship or the company of a fellow young zealot named Wang Xi, a Fuzhou native, who would rise to become a popular revivalist endorsed by missionaries. But they, both Wang Xi and Watchman Nee, had made up their minds to not attach themselves to mission churches. So their same desire to preach a Christianity untainted by Western dominance brought them together in a symbolic creation of a Chinese Christian body of 3 people: Wang's wife, Wang, and Watchman Nee. And Watchman Nee wrote, after they broke bread together in Wang's small house, heaven was so close to earth. They were soon joined by other like-minded youthful converts, most of whom were fellow students at the Anglican Trinity College in Fuzhou. So soon at the Trinity College, Wang Xi and Nee and the few that had joined them, it says about a half a dozen, it probably was growing, but anyway, they found no sign of intense religiosity that would satisfy the burning souls like Watchman Nee's soul. And so they started to meet in a rented house nearby in 1923. They started their separate meetings as well as roadside evangelism. And they would wear white shirts splashed with slogans like "You will die, Jesus is coming, believe in Jesus and live." And this outburst of, it calls it indigenous evangelism, not Western missionaries. But anyway, it matched also a nationalistic movement at the same time, where in China was forming an anti-Christian federation, and it denounced Christianity as an ally of capitalism and imperialism, as a means of oppressing weaker nations. And so Nee's and Wang's conviction to leave denominationalism matched also the nationalistic view of denominationalism, because it was seen as a Western influence. Anyway, let me just read here. Nee's own adjustment to the rise of nationalism had been swift. This is page 161. In late 1922, he had discovered through the scriptures that denominational divisions of the church were unbiblical. He then prevailed upon his father to announce to the Methodist Episcopal Church, to which his family belonged, that since denominationalism was a sin, they had decided to have their names removed from its membership roster, which was called the Book of Life, but which M.E. Barber had pronounced to be full of dead people. However, the small group of mostly student evangelists who came to be called the Christian Assembly was soon divided on how far they should go to assert independence. Nee demanded a complete rejection of denominationalism and its ecclesiastical structure dominated by clergy, and advocated a radical separation from Western missions. Wang, Xi, and the rest of the group, on the other hand, were disinclined toward confrontation with existing churches. By 1924, Wang's own initial roadside evangelism had already extended beyond Fuzhou. Under the influence of a Christian and Missionary Alliance missionary in Shanghai, he was ready to accept ordination as a pastor to formalize the group's evangelistic drive into a new indigenous denomination. The differences turned out to be irreconcilable. Just a little side note is Wang Xi is the one who baptized Ruth Bells, who became the wife of Billy Graham. So I think that's kind of a neat connection. But Watchman Nee shortly after wrote Moanings of the Cross-Bearer. They were serialized in late 1923 in Spiritual Light, a Chinese Christian journal. And in these writings, he ruminated on his loneliness, his frailty. He mused on his love for a woman, which he had surrendered to Christ. He wrote tearfully of his thwarted hope to go to America to study at the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago. Nee's self-imposed exile from mission Christianity had shut the door to church employment, to studying in the U.S., Moody Bible Institute, etc. Barber framed the disappointments that Watchman Nee experienced into a cosmic scheme in which a minority of faithful believers were called to renounce both the decadent church and the perishing world. So she taught him about undergoing tribulations, bearing the cross to receive crowns in heaven. Through this time, Watchman Nee had access to Emmy Barber's bookshelves and began to read a lot of books, the works of several contemporary British nonconformists who pursued a purer spiritual life outside of mainstream Christianity. Okay, so there was Panton, there was Meyer, but actually most influential to Watchman Nee was Jesse Penn Lewis. So I find it really interesting. Watchman Nee was brought to the Lord to be born again with a female revivalist preacher. Through her, he met Emmy Barber, who had the most influence on his theological development. Out of all of his readings, Jesse Penn Lewis seems to have been the most influential. It says, more inspiring than Panton and Meyer for Nee were the works of a contemporary Welsh mystic named Jesse Penn Lewis, the most prominent female speaker at Keswick during the first decade of the 20th century. So then it was through Jesse Penn Lewis that he gained much of his content. He actually became, through Emmy Barber, a translator of Jesse Penn Lewis's work into Chinese. But the role of translator that Barber had conceived for him was too confining because he had already started to print works. And so he started another journal around the time of translating for Jesse Penn Lewis. He started to put out works in Present Witness and Testimony, and then The Christian. He also changed his name to Nee Tao Sheng and rendered it as Watchman Nee in English, mindful of Penn Lewis's prayer for all the faithful watchmen on their watchtowers. So actually it was through a prayer of Jesse Penn Lewis that Watchman Nee decided on his English name, Watchman. Watchman Nee had begun to print his own articles, and he had been translating some for Jesse Penn Lewis's, translating some of Jesse Penn Lewis's work into Chinese. He got sick with tuberculosis, and during that time he wrote his magnum opus, The Spiritual Man. But I do want to say that it says here, I'm just going to read, Nee made no specific mention of the fact, however, that such teachings that he wrote about in The Spiritual Man were already found in Penn Lewis's Soul and Spirit, published a decade or so earlier, or that his foreboding of the impending end of time accorded with that of Meyer, Penn Lewis, and other contemporary British seers of the Advent, and was likewise prudently shorn of a specific time. But he gave no credit to these other Christian writers, authors, for what he wrote about, but they were quite similar. So Nee was both recuperating from tuberculosis as well as writing The Spiritual Man in Nanjing when there was more persecution coming in through what was called the Northern Expedition, which Chiang Kai-shek launched in 1926, and it later reached Nanjing. So Nee decided, as panic was spreading, refugees were fleeing from the area, Nee decided to move to the safety of the international settlement in Shanghai, where he attracted a small but dedicated circle of followers that blossomed into the Little Flock movement. I want to just insert here that while Nee was recuperating from tuberculosis is one of the times that a victim stated he raped her multiple times. And I will come back to that account later. Okay, so chief among Nee's co-workers in Shanghai were Li Yuanru, who is, the English name is Ruth Li, and Wang Paichen, Peace Wang. They were two spirited and able single women. They were resourceful. They played a nurturing and energizing role in the new group. They were slightly older than Nee, and despite their impressive educational and social backgrounds, would quietly remain in the shadow of Nee's charisma in the years to come. Ruth Lee was editor of the Nanjing-based journal The Spiritual Light, to which Nee had submitted his earliest writings. A small and pretty, energetic and discerning woman, Ruth Lee was a native of Tianjin and an atheist in her early years. Anyway, it gives a little bit the story of her coming to the Lord. And then Wang Paichen, Peace Wang, was a first-generation Christian hailed from a venerable family of government administrators. Okay. By May 1927, Wang had distanced herself from denominational missions and was holding communion services with a small group of converts at her house in Shanghai. It was that group that Watchman Nee joined when he moved to Shanghai in the late spring to get away from the northern expedition. Despite his weak constitution, Nee's magnetic personality and his remarkable ability to speak in the profound eschatological language of Western end-time mystics mesmerized the group, and he soon emerged as their indisputable leader. Nee began to build a system of independent churches throughout China. Quote, "I closed my eyes," Nee wrote, "and such a picture appeared before me." In early 1928, the group rented a house off Hardun, Hatong Road, where Nee started pursuing his dream of building a church of God's elect. Its foundation was a revelation of the hidden design of human history, which, like a majestic cosmic clock, ticked precisely and inexorably toward a divine-appointed apocalyptic climax. That revelation rendered all the contemporary chaos and evil in the world intelligible. And for the victorious Christians, the faithful little flock, it also promised a dramatic escape from the end-time tribulations and from death itself through rapture. So the whole little flock name came with the eschatological interpretation that a secret rapture would shelter the faithful from end-time destruction. It comes from the verse Luke 12:32, "Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." To that group bound by brotherly love as the church in Philadelphia, dedicated to keeping his word, God had given the exclusive promise of rapture before the Great Tribulation. And this group, Watchman Nee's group, considered themselves that little flock that would have the exclusive promise of rapture before the Great Tribulation. By then, Nee's own identification with Philadelphia was unmistakable, as was his calling to gather the little flock in China. Equally evident to his audience was the sophisticated light he had shown on the divine scheme. In Shanghai, he organized several Overcomers meetings, echoing the name of the journal, The Overcomer, that Penn Lewis had founded 2 decades earlier. It attracted zealous souls or spirits from neighboring areas. In 1930, the group published Hymns for the Little Flock, which was the exact same name of a collection of hymns published in 1856, prepared by the Plymouth Brethren. Nee's anti-denominationalism was what he claimed to be an outward expression of a profound inner life found in an unadulterated way of being Christian. The little flock was neither a new movement, group, organization, or denomination, he claimed, but a gathering of those who would bring God's plan to fruition. That self-image, at once modest and extravagant and decidedly innocent, was not shared by the Protestant community at large. A report in the China Christian Yearbook of 1932 to 1933 noted that while most revivals during the early 1930s helped to break down denominational barriers and unite the churches on the basis of a common spiritual experience, the self-proclaimed purified body called the Little Flock had frankly declared their purpose to be the destruction of the present church as moribund, corrupt, and apostate, which, wherever their influence spread, has resulted in a group of earnest spirits withdrawing from the churches. An article in the July 1936 issue of the Chinese Recorder lamented that even in the business world, sensible people usually observe some code of professional ethics, such as fair play, and would not openly practice piracy or sabotage, but in the field of evangelism, some had resorted to the tactics of a high-pressure salesman. Indeed, to many missionaries, Watchman Nee seemed but a sheep stealer. Little flock zealots themselves, however, took pride in this relocation of the spiritual herd. Nee would liken other groups to halfway houses. He would call other leaders a childlike figure. He wrote that the Pentecostal practices were heresy, powered by an evil spirit. And yet he himself had a Pentecostal experience, after which he wrote to his comrades in Shanghai announcing, "I have met the Lord." Shortly after Watchman Nee was married in 1934, there was a damning expose about his romantic fickleness and questionable character, including a broken engagement with a girl he had met in Malaya in 1925. Nee withdrew from his top position in the Christian Assembly and was placed under supervision of several elders whom Nee had installed a couple years before. But in 1935, he went to a gathering of the spiritual gifts movement, and there, as he watched Elizabeth Fischbacher, a gifted CIM missionary, holding jubilant revival meetings and speaking in tongues, he found himself also filled with the Holy Spirit, breaking into holy laughter. And with his unfailing flair for hyperbole, he sent a telegram to his comrades in Shanghai announcing, "I have met the Lord." After Nee sent that message that he had met the Lord through that Pentecostal experience, it says that also signaled his return to the helm of that Christian assembly in Shanghai. His endorsement of Pentecostalism in 1935 affected the little flock congregations in various parts of China, or it says it rippled through them. And later that year, the Christian assembly in Quanzhou, Fujian, held protracted overcomers meetings dedicated to the infilling of the Spirit. However, it soon became clear that the much sought after Spirit also defied any order that the local leaders wished to impose. During the meetings, some started to howl, bang on tables and chairs. They staggered up to the platform. They were foaming at their mouths, uttered incoherent, indecent words. The mother of one of the leaders tried to jump out of a window, upstairs window. An evangelist dashed out into the street naked, and a prominent leader sent a chill down quite a few spines when, halfway through his praying and laying on of hands for others, he lapsed into a state of delirium and his voice changed into that of a woman. His frayed nerves never healed through the rest of his life. The panic-stricken congregation filed an urgent report to Nee, who wired back his directive to stop all Pentecostal meetings. Read a little bit here. Though thus clipped of the wings of spiritual gifts, the little flock by 1936 was already a full-fledged messianic sect. It had been drinking deep in the pool of dispensationalist teachings and was assured of its unrivaled place in God's end-time scheme. And I would echo that for sure, that the Lord's Recovery has a sense of an unrivaled place in God's end-time scheme. The abandonment of Pentecostalism was only a withdrawal in its most vaunted and unshaken eschatology. Nee himself stood tall among his followers. He had steadily gained stature after the deaths of Jesse Penn Lewis in 1927 and of Emmy Barber in 1930. He had weathered storms of both unflattering media exposure at home and a troubled relationship with the exclusive Plymouth Brethren in Britain. His interaction with the Brethren, he also became close to and familiar with Darby's teachings and practices. And I just like to read here, one vital ecclesiastical novelty introduced by Darby had been a paradoxical affirmation of one unified true church on earth outside the allegedly corrupted Christendom, and the theoretical independence of each local assembly of believers despite his own tyrannical domination of the Brethren. Nee began introducing the Brethren practice in 1932 when he installed elders and deacons in the Shanghai Assembly and at the same time created a superstructure of apostolic co-workers that included Ruth Lee, Peace Wang, and above all, himself, Nee himself. In 1938, with the rapid expansion of the little flock, which counted more than 200 local assemblies nationwide, Nee codified basic principles of his organization in a book called Rethinking Our Missions. The true believers who constituted the Christian assembly, he wrote, would return to the archetype, the genesis of the church. Administratively, each local assembly would be autonomous and led by its elders who were installed by the apostles. In spiritual matters and in the central mission of establishing churches, however, all the local churches, the self-designation increasingly used thereafter, local churches, would be led by workers, co-workers, or apostles who were chosen by God to be his overseers. There would be no salaried clergy or rigid centralization of finances, yet the faithful in each locality would support their elders, and a spiritually sound local church would certainly know how to supply the needs of the workers. It was a carefully articulated polity, one that Austin Sparks praised as being very clever. It granted an apparent autonomy and flexibility to the local assemblies while presenting submission to the higher authority of workers, headed by Nee, as a matter of spiritual obligation. It also paved the way for later drastic centralization of power by Nee. Okay, and just one other thing, I would say that he mentions that first account witnesses spoke of a patent ring of sublimity that Watchman Nee had when he prayed or when he spoke, a patent ring of sublimity. And I would echo that. I hear that also with many co-workers today in the Lord's Recovery, a patent ring of sublimity. I would like to talk about the records in this book of Watchman Nee's raping of women. So firstly, there was that expose, a damning expose in the Shanghai newspaper in 1934 when he had gotten married. There was an expose that talked about his romantic fickleness and questionable character, including a broken engagement with a girl he had met in Malaya in 1925. So maybe it was just questionable. But in this book, and then I'll go to this book to confirm some things. In this book, it talks about in 1938-ish, don't have the exact year, but it says, in the context of Madame Gaillan's spirituality, where she also had a lot of sensual language of love in her writings, and he adopted those in hymns he wrote about being sick with love, pining for the day of union, etc. It says, this was potent spirituality pulsating with longing and a rapturous joy, yet the line between spiritual and physical abandon is an uncertain one. For Nee, it melted away one night when on a trip to the beautiful city of Hangzhou to lead yet another meeting for the overcomers, he checked into the same hotel room as his two accompanying young female assistants. More revelry of the same nature with the two women and with prostitutes, some of which was strangely recorded on Nee's own cinecamera or video camera, would be exposed later. Around that same time is when he talked about having the blueprint of God's plan in our hand. It was in 1942 that Watchman Nee suffered another setback in his leadership. His sex scandal involving the two young female co-workers was exposed, as were his questionable business dealings. After 1938, he had increasingly involved himself in a pharmaceutical venture with his chemist brother, etc. Someone wrote that Nee's boredom with his mediocre followers who eagerly idolized him as the end-time seer had been partly responsible for his turn from the gospel to business. In 1943, Nee left Shanghai. In a parting letter to his associates, he asked to have his name blotted out from the church register in order to give peace to many hearts and to avoid bringing shame to the name of the Lord. That was in 1943. And now in comes Witness Lee, who played a central role in Nee's reinstatement. Li Chang Shao, Witness Lee. Okay, so I will talk more about Witness Lee in the next segment.